A foggy evening at 221B Baker Street, the Vanishing Violinist. Welcome, dear friend, to this quiet corner of the evening, where stories unfold like mist across cobblestones, and mysteries wait patiently in the shadows. Tonight, we shall venture together into the gas-lit world of Victorian London, where fog curls around street lamps and the rain whispers secrets against window panes. This is a tale meant not to quicken your pulse, but to slow it, to ease your thoughts into gentle currents, to carry you softly towards sleep. So let your shoulders drop, allow your breathing to deepen, and know that there is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do, except rest here with me. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The evening descended upon London like a velvet curtain, heavy and soft, bringing with it the familiar fog that transformed Baker Street into something from a watercolour painting, all edges blurred and softened. Inside the sitting room at 221B, the fire crackled with quiet authority, sending dancing shadows across walls lined with books and curious objects collected over years of peculiar investigations. The rain had begun sometime after 6 o'clock, a gentle, persistent drumming against the windows that created a cocoon of sound, sealing the room away from the world beyond. Sherlock Holmes sat in his favourite armchair, the leather worn smooth by countless evenings just like this one, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin as he stared into the flames. The firelight caught the angles of his face, illuminating the sharp features that so many found intimidating, but which, in moments like these, held a quality almost meditative. He had been silent for the better part of an hour, and I, Dr. John Watson, had learned long ago that such silences were not uncomfortable, but companionable. Each of us lost in our own thoughts, while the rain sang its lullaby outside. I sat across from him, a medical journal open upon my lap, though I confess the words had ceased to register some time ago. Instead, I found myself listening to the symphony of the evening, the fire's soft crackling, the rain's persistent whisper, the occasional pop of settling coals, the distant sound of a carriage passing in the street below, its wheels splashing through puddles, with a sound like hushed conversation. Mrs. Hudson had brought tea earlier, the good china set with its delicate pattern of blue flowers, and the pot still sat on the table between us, wrapped in a quilted cosy that she had made herself. The aroma of bergamot and black tea leaves mingled with the smoke from Holmes's pipe, creating a scent that I had come to associate entirely with home, with safety, with these quiet evenings when the world seemed very far away indeed. The mantelpiece clock ticked steadily, marking time in its patient way, while shadows from the fire performed their nightly dance across the Persian carpet. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like something alive and curious, and through it the street lamps glowed with soft halos of golden light, each one a small beacon in the gathering darkness. It was perhaps 8:30 when we heard footsteps on the stairs. They were hurried, these footsteps, but not frantic, accompanied by the sound of a walking stick tapping against each step with measured rhythm. Mrs. Hudson's voice drifted up from below, offering greeting and assistance, followed by a man's voice, cultured and pleasant, though touched with something that might have been concern. Holmes's eyes opened, and though he did not move from his position of repose, I saw the subtle shift in his attention, the way a cat might become alert while appearing to remain at rest. The footsteps grew closer, ascending the 17 steps to our door. and then came the gentle knock. 3 taps of knuckles against wood. "Come," Holmes called, his voice soft but clear, and the door opened to admit our late-night visitor. The man who entered was perhaps 50 years of age, distinguished in bearing, with silver threading through dark hair, and a face that spoke of culture and refinement. He wore evening dress beneath a well-tailored overcoat, still beaded with rain, and he carried a walking stick of polished ebony topped with silver. But it was his eyes that drew my attention. They held a worry that sat strangely upon features otherwise composed. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, though his gaze had already found my friend, with the certainty of one who knows precisely whom he seeks. "I am he," Holmes replied, gesturing to the chair nearest the fire. "Please, do sit. You have come through foul weather, and I can see that your errand weighs upon you. Watson, would you be so kind as to pour our guest some tea? I believe it is still quite warm." I rose and did as requested, filling one of the delicate cups while our visitor settled himself into the offered chair. He accepted the tea with a murmur of thanks, and I noticed how his hands, though steady, gripped the saucer with perhaps more force than necessary. "Before you fall asleep, write in the comments what time it is for you and where you are from." "My name is Edmund Whitmore," our visitor began, his voice measured and careful. "I am the director of the Royal Academy of Music, and I have come to you regarding a matter that is both delicate and, I fear, rather urgent, though not in any way that involves immediate danger." Holmes nodded, his fingers steepling once more beneath his chin. "Pray continue, Mr. Whitmore. You will find that we are well accustomed to unusual circumstances." Whitmore took a sip of his tea, and I saw some of the tension ease from his shoulders as the warmth spread through him. The fire crackled softly, and the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, creating an atmosphere of intimacy and safety that seemed to encourage confession. "3 days ago," Whitmore said, "one of our most promising young musicians vanished. Her name is Elizabeth Ashford, though she performs under the name Elise Ashton. She is a violinist of extraordinary talent, barely 23 years of age, with a brilliant career stretching before her. She was scheduled to perform at a private concert at Thornfield Manor in Surrey, a prestigious engagement that would have secured her reputation among the most discerning patrons of the arts." He paused, turning the teacup in his hands, as if the motion helped him gather his thoughts. Outside, a gust of wind sent rain pattering more insistently against the glass, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 9 times, the sound muffled and dreamlike through the fog. "She departed London by the afternoon train on Tuesday," Whitmore continued. "She was to stay at the manor for 2 nights, perform on Wednesday evening, and return Thursday morning. But Thursday came and went with no word. Friday, her landlady sent word to me that Miss Ashford had not returned to her lodgings. I made inquiries at Thornfield Manor by telegraph, and received a most peculiar reply." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes bright with interest, though his manner remained one of calm attentiveness. "And what did this reply say?" "That Miss Ashford had never arrived," Whitmore said, and now I could hear the genuine distress beneath his careful composure. "That they had waited for her on Tuesday evening, had held dinner, had postponed the rehearsal, but she simply never appeared. They assumed she had been taken ill or missed her train, and they engaged another musician for Wednesday's performance." The fire settled with a soft sigh, and I found myself leaning forward as well, drawn into the mystery despite the late hour and the soporific comfort of the warm room. There was something in this tale that caught at the imagination, not with fear, but with curiosity, with the gentle puzzle of it. "You have verified her departure from London?" Holmes asked. "I have," Whitmore confirmed. "The station master at Waterloo remembers her distinctly. A young woman carrying a violin case does tend to draw attention, and Miss Ashford is rather memorable in any case, with red hair and a manner of dress that favours emerald green. She purchased a ticket to Guildford, which is the station nearest Thornfield Manor, departing on the 2:15 train. And inquiries at Guildford? The station master there has no recollection of her, though he admits that Tuesday afternoon was particularly busy, and a young woman travelling alone might easily have passed unnoticed if she did not require assistance with luggage." Holmes was silent for a moment, his gaze returning to the fire as he considered this information. I watched the play of firelight across his features, the way it cast his eyes into shadow and illuminated the sharp line of his jaw. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady rhythm, neither increasing nor diminishing, simply persisting in its gentle way. "Tell me," Holmes said at last, "had Miss Ashford seemed troubled in recent days? Any change in her demeanour? Any unusual correspondence? Any mention of concerns or difficulties?" Whitmore considered this carefully, setting down his teacup with a soft clink of china against china. "Now that you mention it, I had noticed that she seemed somewhat distracted over the past fortnight. Not troubled, precisely, but as if her thoughts were often elsewhere. She had been practicing with particular intensity, often staying late at the academy after other students had departed. Our night porter mentioned hearing her violin at quite late hours, playing the same passage over and over, with what he described as almost desperate precision." "And the piece she was practicing?" Holmes asked. "Was it for the Thornfield performance?" "Partly," Whitmore said. "The programme was to include Vivaldi and Mozart, both well within her capabilities. But the porter said the melody he heard most often was something else entirely, something he did not recognize, though he has worked at the Academy for 30 years and knows the repertoire well." The clock ticked on, measuring out seconds that fell soft as snow. I found my eyes growing heavy with the warmth and the lateness of the hour. But the mystery held me, gentle as it was, like a hand guiding me through a dream. Holmes rose from his chair with fluid grace, crossing to the window where he stood, looking out into the fog-shrouded street below. The lamplight caught the edges of his profile, creating a silhouette that might have been painted by one of the Dutch masters, all shadow and subtle illumination. He remained there for several moments, one hand resting against the window frame, the other tucked into the pocket of his dressing gown, while the rain traced wandering paths down the glass like tears on a stranger's face. "This melody that the porter heard," Holmes said, not turning from the window. "Did he attempt to describe it? Was it melancholy, perhaps, or unsettling in its character?" Whitmore shifted in his chair, and I heard the leather creak softly beneath him. He said it was beautiful, but strange, like something very old that had been forgotten and then remembered. He is not a particularly poetic man, our Mr. Davison, so the fact that he described it thus struck me as noteworthy. Holmes turned from the window, his movements unhurried, and returned to his chair. He reached for his pipe, which had gone out during our conversation, and began the ritual of preparing it anew, tamping tobacco with practiced fingers. striking a match that flared bright in the dimness before settling to a steady flame. The first puff of smoke rose toward the ceiling, curling and dissipating in the warm air. "I should like to visit the academy tomorrow," he said, "if that would be convenient. I wish to see Miss Ashford's practice room, to speak with this Mr. Davison, and to examine any correspondence or personal effects she may have left there. Additionally, I will need the address of her lodgings, and a letter of introduction to her landlady." "Of course," Whitmore said, reaching into his coat pocket to withdraw a leather note-case. "I anticipated you might require such information." He extracted several papers, laying them upon the table with careful precision. "Here is Miss Ashford's home address in Bloomsbury, a letter authorizing you to examine her effects at the academy, and the original telegram from Thornfield Manor. I have also included a photograph, taken last year at her debut recital." Holmes accepted these items with a nod of thanks, setting them aside to examine later. "One more question for this evening, Mr. Whitmore. Has Miss Ashford family anyone who should be notified of her absence?" A shadow crossed Whitmore's face, barely perceptible, but there nonetheless. "She is quite alone in the world, I am afraid. Her parents died when she was very young, carried off by influenza within days of each other. She was raised by an aunt in Edinburgh, a woman of some musical talent herself, who recognized and nurtured Elise's extraordinary gift. But the aunt passed away 2 years ago, leaving Elise a small inheritance that allowed her to continue her studies in London. As far as I know, she has no other living relations." The rain seemed to fall more softly now, or perhaps my ears had simply grown accustomed to its constant presence. The room felt very safe, very removed from the troubles of the world, a pocket of warmth and light, suspended in the vast darkness of the London night. I poured myself another cup of tea, adding a touch of milk, and the simple domestic action felt like a meditation, each movement slow and deliberate. "Then we shall begin first thing in the morning," Holmes said. "I suggest you return home, Mr. Whitmore, and attempt to rest. Worry accomplishes nothing, and you have done all that can be done by bringing this matter to my attention. I am confident that we shall unravel this mystery, and I have every hope that Miss Ashford will be found safe and well." Whitmore rose, setting down his empty teacup with visible reluctance, as if the warm room and sympathetic company were difficult to leave. "You cannot know what a relief it is to have placed this burden in your capable hands, Mr. Holmes. Elise is not merely a talented student, she is a kind and gentle soul who has already endured more loss than any young person should. The thought that some further misfortune has befallen her is almost more than I can bear." Holmes walked our visitor to the door, and I heard them speaking in low voices on the landing, making arrangements for the morning. Then came the sound of Whitmore's footsteps descending the stairs, the opening and closing of the street door, and finally, silence save for the rain and the fire and the ticking of the clock. When Holmes returned, he did not resume his seat, but instead stood before the fireplace, one elbow resting upon the mantel, his eyes fixed upon the dancing flames. I knew this posture well. It meant that his mind was already at work, sifting through the information provided, arranging facts into patterns, seeing connections that remained invisible to ordinary observers. "What do you make of it, Watson?" he asked, though his gaze did not leave the fire. I considered the question, turning over in my mind all that we had heard. It seems clear that something happened to Miss Ashford between leaving London and arriving at Thornfield Manor, I said slowly. The question is whether she met with some accident, or whether she chose, for reasons unknown, not to complete her journey. Indeed, Holmes murmured, and that strange melody she was practicing with such intensity, something old and forgotten, according to our porter. Does that not suggest a purpose, Watson? A deliberation, rather than mere accident? The fire crackled its agreement, or so it seemed in that moment, and I watched the shadows shift and dance across the walls. Outside, the fog had grown thicker still, pressing against the windows like something seeking entrance, and the street lamps were now mere suggestions of light, soft and diffused. "You think she meant to disappear?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. He reached for the photograph that Whitmore had left, holding it toward the firelight to examine the young woman's features. Even in the small sepia-toned image, I could see what Whitmore had meant about her being memorable. Delicate features framed by abundant dark hair, though the photograph could not capture the red colour he had mentioned, and eyes that seemed to look past the camera towards something distant and perhaps sad. "I think," Holmes said at last, "that Miss Elizabeth Ashford is searching for something, or perhaps running from something, and that her disappearance, while it has caused distress to those who care for her, may not be entirely involuntary. But we shall know more tomorrow, after we have visited her rooms and spoken with those who knew her daily habits." He set the photograph down and finally returned to his chair, reaching for his pipe once more. The tobacco glowed red as he drew upon it, and the smoke rose in lazy spirals toward the ceiling. I felt my own eyes growing heavy, the warmth and the lateness of the hour and the steady rhythm of the rain, all conspiring to pull me towards sleep. "You should retire, Watson," Holmes said gently, noticing my drowsiness. "Tomorrow may prove to be a long day, and you will want to be well rested. I believe I shall sit here a while longer and think." I nodded, rising from my chair with some reluctance, for there was something deeply peaceful about this room tonight, something that made me wish to remain forever in this moment of quiet companionship and gentle mystery. But Holmes was right. Sleep called to me with insistent tenderness. "Good night, Holmes," I said, and he raised his hand in acknowledgement, his attention already turned inward to the labyrinth of his thoughts. I climbed the stairs to my room, where the fire had been laid and lit by Mrs. Hudson's capable hands, and the bed weighted with clean sheets and warm blankets. Through my window, I could see the fogs swirling in the street below, and I thought of Elizabeth Ashford, somewhere out there in the vast darkness of England, perhaps sleeping peacefully in some unknown refuge, perhaps troubled and afraid, perhaps playing her violin in some lonely place where only the night could hear. The rain continued its gentle song against the roof, and I lay down, pulling the blankets up beneath my chin, feeling the weight of them settle over me like a benediction. My mind drifted over the details of the case, turning them this way and that like pieces of a puzzle, but sleep was stronger than curiosity, and soon even the mystery of the vanishing violinist could not keep me from sliding into dreams. The clock in the hall struck 10, the sound muffled and distant, and I let it carry me deeper into sleep, into that peaceful darkness where mysteries dissolve, and all questions find their answers in the gentle realm of dreams. Morning arrived, not with fanfare, but with gradual revelation. the darkness lifting by degrees until the world outside my window emerged from shadow into the soft grey light of a rainy London dawn. I woke to the sound of sparrows chattering in the eaves and the continued whisper of rain, though it had diminished during the night to little more than mist, a gossamer veil hanging in the air. The room felt cool, but not unpleasant, and I lay for a moment beneath the warmth of my blankets, watching the pale light strengthen against the ceiling. By the time I had dressed and descended to the sitting room, Holmes was already awake and engaged in his morning routine, though I suspected from the freshness of his appearance that he had indeed found some hours of rest during the night. He stood at the window with a cup of coffee in hand, gazing down into Baker Street, where early morning traffic had begun its daily procession. Milk carts and delivery wagons, shopkeepers opening their establishments, the occasional hansom cab carrying some early traveller to their destination. "Good morning, Watson," he said without turning. "I trust you slept well." "Remarkably so," I replied, crossing to the breakfast table where Mrs. Hudson had laid out her usual excellent spread. Toast and butter, marmalade, kippers, eggs prepared just as I preferred them. "Have you been awake long?" "An hour, perhaps," Holmes said, joining me at the table. "I have been reviewing the materials that Whitmore provided, and I confess the case grows more intriguing the more I consider it. There is something here that does not quite fit the pattern of ordinary disappearance, though I cannot yet put my finger upon precisely what troubles me." We ate in comfortable silence, the domestic sounds of breakfast providing a pleasant counterpoint to the soft patter of rain, the clink of cutlery against china, the gentle scrape of butter across toast, the quiet pouring of coffee from pot to cup. Through the windows I could see that the fog had lifted somewhat, though the sky remained overcast, heavy with clouds that promised more rain before the day was through. Holmes had spread the photograph of Elizabeth Ashford beside his plate, and I noticed him glancing at it periodically, as if studying her features might reveal some hidden truth. In the morning light, even filtered through grey skies, I could see more detail than had been visible by firelight. The delicate structure of her face, the intelligence in her eyes, a certain quality of reserve, or perhaps sadness, that seemed to emanate from the image itself. "We shall visit her lodgings first," Holmes said, setting down his coffee cup with quiet precision. The personal effects of a missing person often tell us more than any amount of testimony from acquaintances. People reveal themselves in the objects they keep, the books they read, the correspondence they preserve. Within the hour, we had finished breakfast and prepared ourselves for the journey. Holmes donned his travelling coat and his deerstalker cap, practical choices for a day of investigation in uncertain weather. I selected my own sturdy overcoat and a serviceable hat, and together we descended to the street where the morning air smelled of rain and coal smoke, and the peculiar mix of scents that was uniquely London. We hailed a cab and provided the driver with the Bloomsbury address that Whitmore had supplied. The journey took us through streets beginning to bustle with daily commerce. Flower sellers arranging their wares, newspaper boys calling out headlines, women in practical dress hurrying toward positions in shops and offices. The rain misted down upon it all, softening edges, muffling sounds, creating a dreamlike quality that made the city seem both familiar and strange. Miss Ashford's lodgings proved to be in a respectable boarding house on a quiet street lined with plane trees, their leaves dripping with accumulated moisture. The building itself was well maintained, its brick facade clean, and its windows bright with starched curtains. A small brass plaque beside the door read, Mrs. Henrietta Blackwood, proprietress, and when Holmes knocked, the door was opened almost immediately by a woman of perhaps 60 years, her grey hair neatly arranged, and her dress of sober black enlivened only by a cameo brooch at her throat. Mrs. Blackwood? Holmes inquired, removing his hat. I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague Dr. Watson. Mr. Edmund Whitmore of the Royal Academy has written to inform you of our visit regarding Miss Elizabeth Ashford. Recognition flickered in the woman's eyes, followed by concern that creased her features. Oh yes, Mr. Holmes, do come in. This terrible business has me quite distraught. Miss Ashford has lodged with me for nearly 2 years, and never once has she caused a moment's trouble. Such a quiet, gentle creature, always prompt with her rent, always considerate of the other lodgers. I cannot imagine what might have befallen her. She led us through a hallway, papered in a pattern of climbing roses, and up a narrow staircase to the 2nd floor. The house smelled of beeswax and lavender, and I could hear the faint sound of someone practicing scales on a piano somewhere above us, the notes rising and falling in mechanical repetition. Miss Ashford's room was at the front of the house, overlooking the street, and Mrs. Blackwood produced a key from the chatelaine at her waist, unlocking the door with hands that trembled slightly. I have not disturbed anything since she left, she said. I thought it best to leave it exactly as she kept it, in case it might prove important. The room that greeted us was modest but charming, furnished with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a small writing desk positioned to catch the light from the window, a wardrobe of dark wood, and a comfortable armchair upholstered in faded blue velvet. But it was the personal touches that gave the space its character. A vase of dried flowers on the windowsill, their colours muted but still lovely, several framed botanical prints upon the walls, and everywhere, music. Sheet music covered the desk in neat stacks. More music rested upon a small stand near the window, where the light would be best for reading, and the bookshelf held not only volumes of poetry and novels, but numerous leather-bound collections of compositions. A violin case rested in the corner, and when Holmes opened it with careful reverence, we saw that it contained not her primary instrument, which she had presumably taken with her, but what appeared to be an older violin, perhaps one used for practice or kept as a spare. Holmes moved through the room with the methodical care of a scholar examining an ancient text, his fingers trailing over surfaces, his eyes missing nothing. He examined the music on the desk, flipping through pages with studied concentration, then turned his attention to the wardrobe, where Miss Ashford's modest collection of dresses hung in orderly arrangement. She packed lightly for her journey, he observed. The green dress that Whitmore mentioned she favoured is missing, as are several items that would constitute appropriate concert attire. But she left behind far more than one would expect if she had intended to vanish permanently. Mrs. Blackwood, who had been hovering anxiously near the door, nodded vigorously. Yes, exactly what I thought, Mr. Holmes. If she had meant to run away, surely she would have taken more of her belongings. Her jewellery box is still here, and though she had nothing of great value, there were several pieces with sentimental worth that I cannot imagine her leaving behind. Holmes crossed to the writing desk and began examining its contents more closely, opening the shallow drawer to reveal neat compartments containing pens, ink, sealing wax, and a small collection of correspondence bound with ribbon. He removed these letters and began reading through them, his expression intent, while I wandered to the window and looked out over the rain-dampened street below. The view from Miss Ashford's window showed a perspective of quiet domesticity. The plane trees, with their mottled bark, glistening wet. A neighbour's cat picking its way delicately along a garden wall. The occasional passerby hurrying beneath an umbrella. I found myself imagining the young violinist standing in this very spot, perhaps in the early morning hours before the city fully woke, or in the evening after a day of practice and study, watching the lamplighter make his rounds, touching flame to each gas lamp until the street glowed with soft golden light. Behind me, I heard the rustle of paper as Holmes continued his examination of the letters. Mrs. Blackwood had withdrawn slightly, settling herself in the doorway, with the air of one prepared to wait as long as necessary, her hands folded across her aproned lap, her expression conveying both worry and the peculiar satisfaction that comes from being witness to important proceedings. "These letters are primarily from Mr. Whitmore," Holmes said, after several minutes of silent reading, "concerning arrangements for lessons, performances, and various administrative matters at the Academy. There are also several from music shops regarding the maintenance and repair of her instruments, and a few personal notes from fellow students, all of recent date and quite innocuous in content." He set the bundle aside and reached deeper into the drawer, withdrawing a small leather journal with a clasp. The leather was worn smooth with handling, and when Holmes opened it, I could see that the pages were filled with a graceful, flowing script that spoke of someone who took pleasure in the physical act of writing. "Her diary," Holmes murmured, settling into the chair at the desk to read more comfortably. Let us see what secrets Miss Ashford confided to these pages. The room fell quiet, save for the turning of pages and the continued soft patter of rain against the window. I moved from my position to examine the botanical prints more closely, finding them to be quite lovely renderings of English wildflowers, primrose and bluebell, foxglove and meadowsweet, each one labelled in Latin beneath the image. There was something touching about these simple decorations, this attempt to bring the countryside into a small city room, to surround oneself with beauty, even in modest circumstances. Minutes passed, marked by the gentle ticking of a small porcelain clock on the mantelpiece, its face decorated with hand-painted roses. Holmes read with complete absorption, his finger occasionally marking a passage to return to later, his brow furrowed in concentration. Once or twice he made a soft sound of interest, but he did not speak, and I knew better than to interrupt his study. Finally, after perhaps a quarter of an hour had elapsed, Holmes closed the journal and sat back in the chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic gesture that indicated deep thought. His eyes had taken on that distant quality they acquired when his mind was racing ahead, making connections, assembling patterns from seemingly disparate pieces of information. "Most illuminating," he said at last. "Watson, Mrs. Blackwood, I believe I have found something significant. Miss Ashford's entries over the past month reveal a growing preoccupation with a piece of music that came into her possession quite unexpectedly." He reopened the journal to a marked page and began to read aloud, his voice falling into the rhythm of the young woman's words. "October 12th. The most extraordinary thing occurred today at Hartwell's music shop while searching through a collection of estate sale items, I discovered, tucked inside an old portfolio, a manuscript that took my breath away. The paper is aged, perhaps a century old or more, and the notation is in a hand I do not recognize. Yet the music itself speaks to something deep within my soul. Mr. Hartwell said I might keep it, as it had come with a larger purchase, and he had no use for such fragmentary pieces. I brought it home and played it through, and Watson, I cannot describe the effect it had upon me. It is like hearing a voice from across a great distance, calling one home to a place one has never been. Holmes paused, glancing up at us. She continues in this vein for several entries, describing how the music haunts her, how she finds herself playing it at all hours, how it seems to demand something from her, though she cannot say what. And then, on November 1st, she writes this. He turned several pages and resumed reading. I have done some research into the provenance of this manuscript. The watermark on the paper dates it to approximately 1790, and certain elements of the notation suggest it may be of Celtic origin, perhaps Scottish or Irish. There are markings in the margins that might be words in an old dialect, though I cannot decipher them. I have written to Professor Aldrich at the British Museum to inquire whether he might examine it, but I confess I am reluctant to part with it even temporarily. Playing this music has become essential to me in a way I cannot fully explain. The room seemed to hold its breath as Holmes set down the journal once more. Outside, a church bell tolled the hour, the sound floating through the rain-softened air with dreamlike clarity. Mrs. Blackwood had pressed one hand to her throat, her eyes wide with a mixture of fascination and concern. Did she mention this manuscript to you, Mrs. Blackwood? Holmes asked gently. Did you observe any change in her behaviour during this period? The landlady considered this carefully. She did seem more distracted, now that you mention it, Mr. Holmes. She would come in from her days at the academy and go straight to her room, barely pausing to greet me or the other lodgers, which was quite unlike her usual friendly manner. And yes, I heard her playing at strange hours, sometimes quite late into the night. The melody was beautiful, but unsettling, if I may say so. It made me think of wild places and ancient things, though I am not a fanciful woman by nature. Holmes rose from the desk and moved to examine the music stand near the window. Upon it rested several pieces of sheet music, standard repertoire from the classical canon. But tucked beneath these, almost hidden, was a single sheet of aged paper, the edges browned with time, covered in musical notation written in faded ink. The manuscript itself, Holmes said, lifting it with reverent care. She kept it here, where she could refer to it while practicing. Look at this, Watson. I moved to stand beside him, and together we examined the curious document. The musical notation was indeed unlike anything I had seen before, with certain symbols and markings that seemed to belong to no standard system of composition. In the margins, as Miss Ashford had noted, were what appeared to be words or phrases in a script that might have been Gaelic, though the handwriting was so ornate as to make decipherment extremely difficult. What does it mean? I asked, though I suspected Holmes could not yet answer such a question with any certainty. It means, he said slowly, that Miss Ashford was following a trail of some kind, pursuing a mystery that this music represented. And I believe that trail led her not to Thornfield Manor, but somewhere else entirely, somewhere connected to the origins of this composition. He carefully folded the manuscript and placed it in his inner coat pocket for safekeeping. Then he turned his attention once more to the desk, opening the other drawers systematically, examining every scrap of paper, every notation in appointment books, every seemingly insignificant detail that might provide another piece of the puzzle. In the bottom drawer, wrapped in a silk scarf, Holmes discovered a small collection of objects that seemed to have been kept together deliberately. A very old iron key, black with age and heavy in the hand. A fragment of stained glass depicting what might have been part of a rose window from a church or cathedral. A pressed flower, its purple petals faded to lavender, and a small watercolour painting, no larger than one's palm, showing a ruined stone building on a hillside with mountains in the distance. She was assembling clues, Holmes said, his voice filled with quiet wonder. These objects mean something, represent something. Mrs. Blackwood, did Miss Ashford ever speak to you of travel plans beyond the Thornfield engagement? Did she mention any interest in old buildings, ruins, historical sites? The landlady shook her head slowly. Not to me, sir, though I will say that she spent several afternoons at the British Museum reading room in recent weeks. She mentioned once that she was researching something for personal interest, not for her musical studies. Holmes gathered the objects carefully and added them to his pockets, along with the manuscript. I should like to take these items for examination, with your permission. I will, of course, provide a receipt and return them once our investigation is concluded. Of course, Mr. Holmes. Anything that might help find dear Miss Ashford, Mrs. Blackwood said, wringing her hands with renewed anxiety. You do think she is alive, do you not? You do not suspect foul play? Holmes's expression softened, and he reached out to pat the woman's shoulder in an uncharacteristically gentle gesture. I believe Miss Ashford is very much alive, Mrs. Blackwood, and that she is pursuing something of great importance to her. Whether she is in danger remains to be seen, but I do not believe we are investigating a crime so much as a mystery that Miss Ashford herself was attempting to solve. We shall find her, I give you my word. We departed the boarding house with Mrs. Blackwood's grateful farewells echoing behind us, stepping out into the persistent mist that continued to veil the city in soft grey. The morning had advanced toward midday, though the overcast sky made it difficult to judge the hour with precision. The streets had grown busier since our arrival, and we walked for some minutes in silence, Holmes clearly lost in thought, his hands thrust deep in his pockets, where the mysterious objects from Miss Ashford's room rested like talismans. Our destination now was the Royal Academy of Music, and we made our way through the London streets at a leisurely pace that allowed for observation and contemplation. The city revealed itself in layers, the grand facades of buildings giving way to narrow lanes, prosperous neighbourhoods transitioning into those more modest, always the sound of horses' hooves on cobblestones, the cry of vendors, the rumble of omnibuses carrying their passengers across the vast sprawl of the metropolis. You are forming a theory, I said, as we resumed walking, for I knew the signs of Holmes in the grip of intellectual pursuit. Several theories, he replied, though none yet complete. The manuscript is clearly central to everything. An old piece of music, possibly Scottish or Irish in origin, discovered by chance in a music shop. Miss Ashford becomes obsessed with it, practices it constantly, researches its provenance. She collects objects that must relate somehow to this pursuit. A key, a piece of stained glass, a painting of ruins. And then she boards a train ostensibly bound for Thornfield Manor, but never arrives at her destination. We turned onto a broader avenue where the traffic moved in steady streams, and I noticed how the rainwater had collected in ruts and depressions, creating mirrors that reflected the sky and the buildings and the passing crowds in shimmering fragments. "You believe she deliberately went somewhere else," I said. "I am certain of it, Watson. The question is where and why, and whether she found what she was seeking, or has encountered some difficulty in her quest. The objects she collected suggest a specific location, a place of some historical significance. The ruins in the watercolor painting are particularly intriguing. If we can identify that building, we may well discover where Miss Ashford has gone." The Royal Academy of Music stood before us soon after, an impressive building of Portland stone with tall windows that promised rooms filled with natural light. Even from the street, we could hear the faint sounds of music drifting from within. A piano somewhere playing scales, a violin attempting a difficult passage, the warm tones of a violoncello practicing long, sustained notes that seemed to hold all the melancholy of the grey day within their vibration. Mr. Whitmore himself met us in the entrance hall, his face lighting with hope when he saw us approach. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming so promptly. I have prepared everything as you requested. Miss Ashford's practice room has been left undisturbed, and Mr. Davison, our night porter, is available to speak with you." He led us through corridors lined with portraits of distinguished musicians and composers, their painted eyes seeming to follow our progress with solemn interest. The building possessed that peculiar quality of places dedicated to art, a sense of time layered upon time, of countless hours of practice and performance, and dedication accumulating like sediment to create something almost sacred. Miss Ashford's practice room proved to be small but pleasant, with a window overlooking a courtyard where a few hardy trees still clung to their autumn leaves. The room contained little beyond the essentials: a music stand, a straight-backed chair, a small table, and a cabinet where sheet music could be stored. But here too, as in her lodgings, her personality had left its mark. A small vase that had held flowers, now empty but for a few fallen petals, a shawl draped over the chair back, and upon the music stand more sheets covered in notation, some printed, others written in her own graceful hand. Holmes immediately set about examining everything with meticulous care. He studied the music on the stand, leafed through the contents of the cabinet, even examined the window-sill where the vase sat, running his fingers along the surface as if reading some invisible text inscribed there. "Whitmore mentioned she stayed late to practice," Holmes said, without looking up from his examination. "Did she always use this same room?" "Yes," Whitmore confirmed. "Students of her advanced level are assigned permanent practice spaces. This has been hers since she joined the academy nearly 2 years ago." I wandered to the window and looked down into the courtyard, where rain had collected in a stone bird bath, and a single blackbird perched on its edge, dipping its beak to drink. The scene was peaceful, timeless, and I found myself imagining Elizabeth Ashford standing in this exact spot, perhaps resting between pieces, watching the seasons change through this same window, spring blossoms giving way to summer green, autumn gold fading to winter bare branches. "The music she was practicing," Holmes said, turning to face Whitmore. "The mysterious melody that your porter heard. Do you see any trace of it here among these papers?" Whitmore moved to the music stand and examined the sheets carefully, lifting each one to peer at those beneath. "These are all standard repertoire," he said slowly. "Vivaldi, as I mentioned, and Mozart, and some technical exercises by Kreutzer. But no, nothing that looks like what you described from her journal. Nothing on aged paper or in unusual notation." "She kept it with her, then," Holmes murmured. "She would not have left something so precious in a practice room where others might disturb it. It was too important, too central to whatever she was pursuing." A knock at the door announced the arrival of Mr. Davison, the night porter, a man of late middle years, with the weathered face of one who had spent much of his life outdoors before taking up indoor employment. He entered with the diffident manner of someone unused to being consulted on important matters, his cap clutched in his hands. "Mr. Davison," Holmes said warmly, "thank you for speaking with us. I understand you heard Miss Ashford practicing here late in the evening on several occasions. Can you describe for us what you observed?" Davison relaxed somewhat under Holmes's friendly manner. "Well, sir, it were a regular thing these past few weeks. Most nights I'd hear her violin going when I made my rounds, sometimes as late as 10 or 11 o'clock. Beautiful playing it was, though sad-like, made me think of my grandmother, who came from the Highlands, and the songs she used to sing about the old days and the old ways." "The melody reminded you of Scottish music?" Holmes asked with sudden intensity. "Aye, that it did, though different somehow, like it were older even than the old songs I remembered. And there were a quality to it that made the hair stand up on the back of your neck, if you'll pardon me saying so. Not frightening, exactly, but uncanny, like hearing the wind speak, or stones singing. I don't have the words for it proper, but it stirred something deep, it did." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Did you ever see Miss Ashford during these late practice sessions? Did you speak with her?" "Only once, sir, about a week ago. I knocked gentle-like to ask if she needed anything before I locked up for the night. She opened the door, and I could see she'd been crying, though she smiled and said she was quite well, just moved by the music. She had that look about her, though, like someone who's made up their mind about something important, something that maybe scares them a bit, but they're going to do it anyway." The porter's words seemed to hang in the air of the small practice room, settling around us like the dust motes that drifted through the pale light from the window. Holmes remained very still, his eyes fixed on Davison's face with that peculiar intensity that meant he was cataloguing every detail, every nuance of expression and tone. "Did she say anything else during that exchange?" Holmes asked softly. "Anything at all, even something that seemed inconsequential at the time?" Davison furrowed his brow in concentration, clearly making an effort to recall the exact details of the encounter. "She thanked me for my concern, said I reminded her of someone kind from her childhood. And then, just as I was turning to leave, she said something strange. She said, 'Soon the circle will be complete, and I shall finally understand.' Those were her exact words, sir, because they struck me as odd, and I thought about them afterward. The circle will be complete." I watched Holmes absorb this information, saw the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated significance. He thanked Davison for his time and attention, and the porter departed with a small bow, leaving us alone once more with Whitmore. Holmes moved to the window, drawing from his pocket the watercolour painting we had found among Miss Ashford's possessions. He held it up to the natural light, examining it with minute attention, turning it this way and that to catch every detail visible in the tiny brushstrokes. "Whitmore," he said, without turning from his study of the painting, "you mentioned that Miss Ashford was raised by an aunt in Edinburgh. Do you know anything of that aunt's background, her occupation or interests?" "I believe she was a music teacher herself," Whitmore replied, "though I do not know much beyond what Elise mentioned in passing. She spoke of her aunt with great fondness, said the woman had been both parent and teacher to her, that everything she knew of music and life she had learned at her aunt's knee." "And the aunt's name?" "Margaret Ashford, I believe, though I am not entirely certain. Why do you ask?" Holmes lowered the painting and turned to face us, and I could see that his mind had made some connection, had drawn together threads that remained invisible to me. "Because I believe that Miss Elizabeth Ashford is not merely pursuing an academic interest in old music, gentlemen. I believe she is following a path laid out for her, perhaps even intended for her, by this aunt who raised her. The manuscript, the objects she collected, the ruins in this painting, all of it points to something specific, something personal." He crossed to the table and laid out the watercolour where we could all examine it more closely. The painting showed a stone structure in evident decay, its walls partially collapsed, what might have been a tower or keep, rising against a backdrop of mountains, rendered in misty blues and purples. In the foreground, barely visible unless one looked closely, was a figure in green, perhaps a woman, standing before the ruins with her back to the viewer. This was painted by someone who knew this place intimately, Holmes said, pointing to various details. "See how the artist has captured the specific way the light falls across these stones, the exact configuration of the remaining walls. This is not an imaginary or composite scene, but a portrait of an actual location, and I would wager a considerable sum that this location is in Scotland, probably in the Highlands, given the character of those mountains." Whitmore leaned in to study the painting more carefully. "But how does this connect to Elise's disappearance? Even if you are correct about the location being in Scotland, why would she abandon her engagement at Thornfield Manor to travel there?" "That," Holmes said, carefully returning the painting to his pocket, along with the other objects, "is precisely what we must determine. Watson, I believe our next step must be the British Museum reading room. If Miss Ashford spent several afternoons there researching something, there will be records of the materials she consulted. Those records may tell us exactly what she was searching for." We took our leave of Whitmore, with assurances that we would keep him informed of any developments, and emerged once more into the grey afternoon. The rain had diminished to little more than a fine mist that hung in the air like breath on a cold morning, and the streets gleamed wet and dark beneath our feet as we walked. The British Museum rose before us, its Greek Revival facade lending it the air of a temple to knowledge, which in many ways it was. Inside, the great domed reading room awaited, circular and magnificent, its shelves rising tier upon tier toward the skylight far above. Readers sat at the long desks that radiated from the centre like spokes of a wheel, bent over their books and manuscripts in attitudes of scholarly devotion. Holmes approached the desk where an elderly librarian sat cataloguing new acquisitions, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose, his fingers stained with ink from decades of careful notation. The man looked up at our approach and his face brightened with recognition. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper in deference to the sanctity of the reading room. "How delightful to see you again. Are you pursuing some new investigation?" "Indeed I am, Mr. Pemberton," Holmes replied, matching the librarian's hushed tone. "I am trying to trace the research activities of a young woman who I believe spent several afternoons here in recent weeks. Her name is Elizabeth Ashford, and I have reason to believe she was consulting materials related to old Scottish music, possibly folk traditions or historical manuscripts." Pemberton's face creased in thought, one finger tapping against his lips. Ashford. Yes, I do recall the young lady. Red hair, was it not? Very polite, very focused in her research. She requested quite a number of items from our collection of Celtic manuscripts and historical documents relating to the Scottish Highlands. "Do you maintain records of which specific materials she consulted?" Holmes asked, and I could hear the controlled excitement in his voice. "But of course," Pemberton said, rising from his desk with the stiffness of one who had sat too long in one position. "Every request is logged in our registry. If you will follow me to the records office, I can provide you with a complete list of everything Miss Ashford examined during her visits." We followed him through a door behind the main desk, into a smaller room lined with filing cabinets and ledgers, the accumulated records of countless scholarly inquiries. Pemberton moved with practiced efficiency, selecting a large volume and laying it open on a reading table, his finger running down columns of entries until he found what he sought. "Here we are," he said, pointing to several lines written in a neat clerical hand. "Miss Ashford visited on 4 separate occasions over the past month. Let me see. She consulted the MacLeod manuscript collection, which contains medieval Scottish poetry and songs, the Carmichael collection of Highland folklore, a portfolio of 18th century maps of the Western Isles, and most intriguingly, a rather obscure volume titled The Lost Sanctuaries of the Celtic Church, published privately in 1873 by a Reverend Angus MacKinnon." Holmes leaned over the ledger, his eyes scanning the entries with fierce concentration. "This last volume," he said. "Do you recall anything about its contents?" Pemberton adjusted his spectacles and considered. "I took the liberty of glancing through it when I retrieved it for Miss Ashford, as it is not a work we are often asked to produce. As I recall, it concerned itself with documenting remote religious sites in the Scottish Highlands, many of them in ruins even at the time of the Reverend MacKinnon's writing. He theorized that these sites had been places of worship since pre-Christian times, that the early Celtic Church had simply adapted existing sacred locations rather than building anew. And would this volume contain illustrations or maps of these sites? Holmes asked. Oh yes, quite detailed ones. The Reverend MacKinnon was an amateur artist of some skill, and he included his own sketches and watercolours of each location he visited. Holmes straightened from the ledger, his expression alive with the thrill of discovery. Mr. Pemberton, might it be possible for us to examine this volume ourselves? I believe it may contain information crucial to our investigation. The librarian nodded readily. Certainly, Mr. Holmes. I shall retrieve it for you at once. Please make yourselves comfortable at one of the reading desks, and I will bring it to you directly. We settled ourselves at a desk near one of the tall windows, where the grey afternoon light filtered through, illuminating the polished wood surface with a soft, diffused glow. Around us, the reading room maintained its atmosphere of hushed concentration. Scholars and students bent over their work. The only sounds, the occasional turning of pages, the scratch of pen on paper, the distant footfalls of librarians moving through the stacks. Within minutes, Pemberton returned, carrying a large volume bound in faded green cloth, its spine lettered in gold that had dulled with age. He laid it before us with the reverence due to any rare book, and Holmes immediately opened it, his fingers careful as he turned the pages. The book was indeed as Pemberton had described, a meticulous catalogue of remote religious sites scattered throughout the Scottish Highlands and Islands. Each entry consisted of historical notes about the location, speculation about its original purpose and significance, and most importantly, detailed illustrations showing the ruins as they had appeared during Reverend Mackinnon's visits in the 1860s and 70s. Holmes turned the pages slowly, studying each illustration with intense focus, while I read over his shoulder the Reverend's flowing prose describing his journeys to these distant places. The writing had a poetic quality, suffused with wonder at the wild beauty of the landscapes and the mysterious aura that clung to these ancient stones. We were perhaps halfway through the volume when Holmes suddenly stopped, his finger pressing against an illustration that occupied a full page. "Watson," he said quietly, "look at this." The watercolour showed a ruined stone structure set upon a hillside, mountains rising in the distance. The same scene we had found painted in miniature among Miss Ashford's possessions. But this was rendered in far greater detail, showing not only the ruins themselves, but also the surrounding landscape. A small loch visible in the valley below, a stand of ancient trees, and what appeared to be standing stones arranged in a semicircle before the ruins. The caption beneath the illustration read, "The Chapel of St. Columba, Glen Corach, Western Highlands, site of particular interest due to presence of pre-Christian stone circle and persistent local traditions associating the location with bardic gatherings and musical instruction in centuries past." Holmes read the accompanying text aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. This remote chapel, accessible only by foot or horseback from the village of Kinloch, some 5 miles distant, occupies a site of evident antiquity. Local tradition holds that before the arrival of Christianity, this was a gathering place for bards and musicians who came from throughout the Celtic lands to study and preserve the old songs. The standing stones that remain suggest ritual significance, and indeed, the shepherds who graze their flocks in the valley below speak of hearing music carried on the wind from the ruins, particularly at twilight and dawn. Whether this is mere fancy or some acoustic peculiarity of the location, I cannot say. But the site possesses an atmosphere of profound peace and timeless mystery. The room seemed to recede around us as the significance of this discovery settled over me. Here was the answer to where Elizabeth Ashford had gone, the destination that had called to her with such insistence that she had abandoned all other obligations to pursue it. "The manuscript she found," I said slowly, working through the implications. "It must have originated from this place, from this tradition of bardic music." And somehow she discovered this connection, traced it back through history to this specific location. Holmes nodded, his eyes still fixed on the illustration. "And more than that, Watson. Remember the objects she collected, the key, the fragment of stained glass, the pressed flower. I would wager that each of these relates somehow to Glen Corach, to the chapel and its history. She was not merely researching an academic curiosity. She was preparing for a pilgrimage, a journey to the source of the music that had captured her soul. He turned more pages, finding additional references to Glen Corach scattered throughout the text. Reverend McKinnon had evidently been fascinated by the site, returning to it multiple times during his researches. In one passage, he mentioned interviewing an elderly woman in Kinloch who claimed her grandmother had possessed a key to the chapel's undercroft, where ancient manuscripts had supposedly been hidden during times of religious persecution. A key, the very item we had found among Miss Ashford's possessions. Another passage described fragments of stained glass that had been discovered among the ruins, bearing symbols that predated Christian iconography, suggesting the site's pre-Christian origins. And in a footnote, almost as an afterthought, McKinnon mentioned a particular species of purple heather that grew nowhere else in Scotland, except on the hillside surrounding the chapel, blooming with unusual persistence, even in poor weather. The pressed flower with its faded purple petals. She was following a map of clues, Holmes said, wonder evident in his tone despite his usual analytical detachment. Each object she collected was both evidence of her research and a talisman, a connection to the place she was journeying toward. This was not impulsive, Watson. This was carefully planned, methodically prepared for over weeks, or perhaps months. I thought of the diary entry we had read in her room, her words about the circle being complete, about understanding finally being within reach. But why the secrecy? I asked. Why not simply tell Whitmore or her friends where she was going? Why disappear in a manner that would cause such worry? Holmes closed the book gently, his expression thoughtful. Perhaps because she feared they would not understand, or worse, that they would attempt to dissuade her. This was clearly a journey of profound personal significance. Watson, something that went beyond professional ambition or ordinary curiosity. The manuscript called to her, awakened something in her heart that demanded answer. How could she explain such a thing to practical-minded colleagues who would see only risk and impropriety in a young woman travelling alone to a remote location in the Highlands? He rose from the desk and moved to the window, looking out over the grey city with its endless rooftops and chimneys. And there is another consideration, he continued. Her aunt, who raised her, who taught her everything she knew of music. What if this quest was in some way a fulfillment of something begun by the aunt? What if Margaret Ashford had possessed knowledge of this place, this tradition, and had passed it to her niece along with her musical education? The thought was both beautiful and melancholy. The image of knowledge and purpose transmitted across generations, a sacred trust from one musician to another. I joined Holmes at the window, watching as the afternoon edged toward evening, the light growing dimmer, the gas lamps in the streets below beginning to glow like earthbound stars. We must go to Glen Corach, I said, stating what we both already knew. Indeed we must, Holmes agreed. If Miss Ashford is there, as I believe she is, we must ensure she is safe and well. And if she has already departed, we must follow her trail until we find her. Whitmore entrusted us with her welfare, and we shall not fail in that charge. We thanked Pemberton for his invaluable assistance, and departed the British Museum as the day surrendered fully to dusk. The street lamps cast pools of warm light across the wet pavements, and the city seemed to settle into its evening rhythms. Workers returning home, theatres preparing for their evening performances, restaurants lighting their windows to welcome diners. As we walked back toward Baker Street, Holmes outlined his plan. We shall take the night train to Glasgow, then continue by local trains and hired conveyance to this village of Kinloch. According to Mackinnon's account, the journey from Glasgow can be accomplished in a day if one makes good connections, though the final approach to the glen must be done on foot. We should pack for rough travel and uncertain weather, Watson. The Highlands in November are not forgiving to the unprepared. I nodded my agreement, my mind already turning to practical considerations. Warm clothing, sturdy boots, medical supplies in case they should be needed. But beneath these practical thoughts ran a current of something else, a sense of anticipation mixed with an odd melancholy. We were following in the footsteps of a young woman who had set out alone on a quest that mattered more to her than safety or convention, and there was something noble in that, something that commanded respect, even as it inspired concern. The fog had returned with nightfall, thicker now, transforming familiar streets into mysterious passages where sound carried strangely, and every shadow might conceal wonders or dangers. But within the fog, London glowed with its 1,000 lights, warm and alive, a city of endless stories unfolding in countless rooms and hearts. Baker Street welcomed us with the familiar warmth of home, the windows of our sitting room glowing golden against the deepening night. Mrs. Hudson met us at the door with her usual efficient solicitude, informing us that she had kept dinner warm and would have it sent up directly. The aroma of roasted meat and vegetables drifted up the stairs as we climbed, and I realized that the day's investigations had left me considerably hungrier than I had noticed. The fire had been built up in our absence, and the room radiated comfortable heat that drove away the chill and dampness we had accumulated during our travels through the city. Holmes moved immediately to his desk, spreading out the various items we had collected. The manuscript with its mysterious notation, the iron key, the fragment of stained glass that caught the firelight and threw tiny rainbows across the wall, the pressed flower, and the watercolour painting that had led us to Reverend Mackinnon's invaluable volume. I settled into my chair and watched him arrange these objects in a careful pattern, his mind clearly working to understand the full scope of what we had uncovered. Mrs. Hudson arrived with dinner on a tray, setting it upon the table with quiet grace before withdrawing. The simple meal of roasted chicken, potatoes, and winter vegetables had never seemed more appealing, and we ate in companionable silence, each lost in our own thoughts about the journey that awaited us. After we had finished eating, and Holmes had lit his pipe, filling the room with fragrant smoke that curled lazily toward the ceiling, he finally spoke. "I have been considering the timeline, Watson. Miss Ashford departed London on Tuesday afternoon, ostensibly bound for Guildford, and then Thornfield Manor. But we now know that was never her true destination. She must have changed trains, perhaps at Guildford itself, or continued north from London on a different line entirely." He rose and went to the bookshelf, selecting a Bradshaw's Railway Guide and flipping through its pages. If she wished to reach Glasgow quickly, she would have taken the express from Euston. That would have put her in Glasgow by Wednesday morning at the latest. From there, the journey to the Western Highlands requires several changes, smaller local lines, each one taking her deeper into more remote territory. I imagined her on those trains, her violin case beside her, the manuscript carefully tucked among her possessions, watching through the window as the landscape transformed from city to countryside to the wild grandeur of the highlands. Had she been afraid, excited, some mixture of both, perhaps, her heart full of purpose and uncertainty in equal measure? She could have reached Kinloch by Wednesday evening. Holmes continued, tracing routes through the guide with one finger. And if the weather held, she might have attempted the walk to Glen Corrack on Thursday morning. That means she has been there, if our suppositions are correct, for 3 full days now. Alone in a ruined chapel in November, I said, concern evident in my voice. Holmes, even if she prepared carefully, the conditions could be quite harsh. The nights are long and cold, and if the weather turned foul... I know, Watson, he said quietly, setting down the railway guide, which is why we must not delay. I had thought to spend tomorrow gathering additional information, but I believe instead we should depart tonight. The 10 o'clock from Euston will have us in Glasgow by morning, and we can be on our way to the Highlands immediately thereafter. The decision made, we set about preparing for the journey with practiced efficiency. I packed my medical bag with additional supplies, knowing that in remote regions such assistance might be needed and difficult to obtain. Holmes gathered the objects from Miss Ashford's collection, wrapping them carefully in cloth before placing them in his travelling case. We both selected warm clothing suitable for Highland weather: heavy coats, woolen scarves, sturdy walking boots that could withstand rough terrain. Mrs. Hudson, informed of our imminent departure, bustled about with sandwiches and a flask of brandy, mothering us in her gentle way while trying to hide her worry about our travelling into such wild country. "You will be careful, won't you, Mr. Holmes?" she said as she helped us into our coats. "The Highlands can be treacherous, especially this time of year." "We shall take every precaution, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes assured her with uncharacteristic warmth, "and we shall return before you have time to miss us properly." The hansom we engaged carried us through streets now fully claimed by night, the fog swirling in our wake like something alive and curious. Euston Station rose before us, its great arched entrance admitting us into the vast space within, where trains waited like sleeping dragons, steam rising from their engines, the smell of coal smoke and hot metal hanging heavy in the air. We found our compartment on the Glasgow Express, a first-class carriage that offered comfort if not luxury. Upholstered seats, small lamps that could be adjusted for reading, windows that looked out upon the platform where late travellers hurried to board. The whistle sounded, the conductor called out final warnings, and then, with a great hiss and a lurch, the train began to move, pulling away from London and into the night beyond. The city fell away gradually, its lights thinning and scattering until we were moving through countryside, rendered invisible by darkness. Only our own reflection visible in the window glass. Holmes had settled into his corner with a book, though I noticed he read without his usual concentration, his eyes occasionally lifting to stare at nothing, while his mind pursued thoughts I could only guess at. I attempted to read as well, but found my attention wandering. The rhythm of the train was hypnotic, the wheels clicking over joins in the track, creating a pattern that seemed almost musical. A steady beat underlying everything, a bass line upon which melody might be built. Was this how Miss Ashford had experienced her journey? Had she heard music in the train's motion? Had she perhaps even taken out her violin during some quiet stretch and played, filling the carriage with the mysterious melody that had called her northward. The hours passed in this dreaming way, stations appearing and disappearing like visions, crew with its blazing lights and hurrying crowds, then smaller stops where few passengers boarded or departed, where the platform lamps glowed lonely in the vast darkness. Somewhere north of Preston, I fell into a doze, lulled by the train's motion and the warmth of the compartment. I woke to find pale grey light beginning to show in the east, and Holmes still awake beside me, now gazing out the window at the landscape revealing itself in the dawn. We had entered different country during the night. Hills rolled away on either side, rocky and crowned with clouds, and I caught glimpses of water, silver in the early light, that might have been rivers or lochs. "We are in Scotland," Holmes said, noting my waking. "We should reach Glasgow within the hour. I have been consulting the timetables, and if we are fortunate with our connections, we can be in the vicinity of Kinloch by late afternoon." Glasgow greeted us with a brisk wind that carried the scent of the sea and industry mingled together, a city waking to its daily labours, beneath skies that promised rain before the day was through. We had time enough to take breakfast at the station hotel, a hearty Scottish meal of porridge and eggs and strong tea that fortified us for the journey ahead. Holmes maintained a quiet intensity throughout, checking his pocket watch frequently, consulting railway timetables, ensuring that we would miss none of our connections into the increasingly remote regions we sought. The trains grew smaller and more local as we progressed westward, the carriages less comfortable, the stations little more than wooden platforms with a single building attached. But the landscape grew ever more magnificent, compensating for any lack of amenity with vistas of stunning beauty. Mountains rising stark against the sky, their peaks lost in cloud, valleys carved deep by ancient glaciers, now filled with dark lochs that reflected the heavens like mirrors, hillsides covered in bracken that glowed copper and gold even under grey skies. At each station, fewer passengers remained aboard, until finally we shared our carriage with only a shepherd returning from market, and an elderly woman dressed in traditional Highland clothing who spoke in Gaelic to the conductor. The world beyond the windows became wilder with each passing mile, the hand of civilization lighter upon the land, nature asserting its dominance through sheer scale and untamed grandeur. It was nearing 4 o'clock when we finally descended at a tiny station that the conductor announced as the closest stop to Kinloch. The platform was deserted, save for ourselves, and a single porter who regarded our arrival with undisguised curiosity. Holmes inquired about transportation to Kinloch village, and the man directed us to a local farmer who sometimes carried passengers in his cart for a modest fee. We found the farmer, a taciturn man of middle years named MacLeod, preparing to depart with a load of supplies. He agreed to take us to Kinloch, and we climbed aboard the rough cart, settling ourselves among sacks of grain and crates of provisions, while MacLeod took up the reins. The horse moved at a steady walk along a narrow road that wound between hills, the cart swaying and creaking, the landscape unfolding around us in austere beauty. MacLeod proved more talkative once we were underway, his initial reserve thawing in the face of Holmes's interested questions about the area. "Kinloch's a wee place," he said, his accent thick but comprehensible. "Maybe 24 families, mostly shepherds, and a few who work the fishing when the season's right. We've an inn that takes the occasional traveller, though visitors are rare this time of year. "We are searching for a young woman," Holmes said carefully. "Red-haired, travelling alone, carrying a violin. She would have passed through within the last few days. Do you recall seeing anyone of that description?" MacLeod's expression shifted to one of recognition. I do indeed. 3 days past, she came through on the afternoon coach from the railway. Stayed the night at the inn, she did. Then set out the next morning on foot toward Glen Corach. Caused quite a stir, a young lady travelling alone to such a remote place. Mrs. Campbell at the inn tried to persuade her to wait for better weather, or at least take a guide, but the lass was determined. Relief flooded through me at this confirmation that Miss Ashford had reached her destination safely, or at least had been well when last seen. Holmes leaned forward with renewed interest. "And has she returned to the village since?" MacLeod shook his head slowly. "Not that I've heard, and word travels fast in a place as small as Kinloch. If she'd come back, someone would have mentioned it." "This Glen Corach," Holmes continued. "How difficult is the approach? What is the terrain like?" "'Tis a fair walk, 5 miles or so along a shepherd's track that climbs steadily. The glen itself sits high in the hills, sheltered somewhat, but exposed to weather coming off the western sea. The old chapel ruins are there, what's left of them. Local folk don't go there much, though the shepherds pass through when moving their flocks. There's stories about the place, old tales passed down through generations." "What manner of tales?" I asked, intrigued despite myself. MacLeod glanced at us, perhaps gauging whether we would scoff at such things. "They say it's a thin place, where the veil between worlds grows sheer. That music can be heard there when no earthly musician plays, especially at twilight, and that those who seek knowledge of the old ways might find it there, though whether that's blessing or curse depends on what they're seeking and what they're willing to pay." The cart rolled onward through the gathering afternoon, the sky darkening overhead as clouds massed for rain. We passed scattered cottages, smoke rising from their chimneys, sheep grazing on hillsides that rose steep and rocky. The landscape had a timeless quality, as if we had travelled not merely through space, but through centuries, back to an older Scotland where ancient beliefs still held sway. Kinloch appeared as we crested a rise, a small cluster of stone buildings arranged along a single street, a church with a modest steeple, and at the far end, a 2-story structure that proclaimed itself the Kinloch Inn, with a painted sign showing a leaping stag. The village was quiet in the late afternoon, a few figures visible moving about their business, smoke rising from chimneys into the still air. MacLeod deposited us at the inn with wishes for good fortune in our search, refusing payment beyond what was fair, despite our insistence. The inn's door opened to admit us into a low-ceilinged common room where a peat fire burned in a wide hearth, filling the space with warmth and the distinctive sweet smoky scent of burning turf. A woman emerged from a back room, wiping her hands on her apron, her weathered face breaking into a welcoming smile. "Good evening to you, gentlemen," she said, her accent musical. "I'm Mrs. Campbell. You'll be wanting rooms, I expect, and perhaps a hot meal after your journey." Holmes introduced us and confirmed that we would indeed require accommodation. "We are also hoping you might provide information about a young woman who stayed here several days ago. Miss Elizabeth Ashford, travelling from London, carrying a violin." Mrs. Campbell's expression shifted to one of recognition, mixed with concern. "Aye, poor lass. I remember her well. Arrived late on Tuesday, looking fair exhausted from her journey, but her eyes were bright with purpose, if you know what I mean. She took a room for the night, ate her supper quiet-like, then retired early. Next morning she was up with the dawn, insisted on setting out for Glencorach, despite my warnings about the weather and the isolation. She said she had come too far to turn back, that she needed to reach the old chapel before the new moon." "The new moon?" Holmes repeated with sharp interest. "Aye, tonight it is," Mrs. Campbell said, glancing toward the window where the afternoon was surrendering to evening. "The darkest night of the month. I told her the old stories, warned her about the strange reputation of that place, but she only smiled and said she knew the stories well, that they were part of why she had come." Holmes and I exchanged glances, both understanding the urgency that now pressed upon us. If Miss Ashford had planned her journey to arrive at Glencorach on the night of the new moon, then tonight held significance for whatever purpose had drawn her to this remote place. We could not afford to wait for morning. We would need to set out immediately if we hoped to reach her before darkness fell completely. "Mrs. Campbell," Holmes said with quiet urgency, "we must reach Glencorach tonight. Can you provide us with directions, perhaps a lantern for the return journey? We are experienced travellers, and will not be deterred by rough terrain or uncertain weather." The innkeeper studied us for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "You'll be wanting to help the lass, then, not to drag her back against her will." She had the look of someone following their heart's true calling, and I'd not want to see that disturbed without good cause. "We wish only to ensure her safety," I assured her. "Her friends in London are concerned for her welfare, but we have no intention of forcing her return if she is well and has found what she seeks." Mrs. Campbell nodded slowly. "The path begins just beyond the last cottage on the north edge of the village. Follow it upward, always keeping to the higher ground when the way forks. The track is well worn by sheep and shepherds, and though it climbs steadily, it's clear enough even in failing light. Glencorach sits in a bowl between two peaks, perhaps 2 hours' walk at a steady pace. The chapel ruins stand on the eastern side of the glen, near a small burn that flows down from the heights. You cannot miss them once you enter the glen proper." She disappeared into the back rooms and returned with a sturdy lantern, several candles, and a small parcel wrapped in cloth. "Bread and cheese," she explained, "in case you or the young lady have need of sustenance. And take care in the ruins themselves. The stones are old and some are loose, easily dislodged. I would not want you taking a fall in the darkness." We thanked her profusely and stepped out into the evening, which had deepened considerably during our brief time indoors. The air had grown colder, carrying the promise of rain, or perhaps even snow before morning. The village lay quiet around us, lights beginning to glow in cottage windows, the first stars appearing in breaks between the clouds overhead. We found the path exactly as Mrs. Campbell had described, a narrow track worn smooth by countless feet, both human and animal, leading upward from the village into the hills beyond. Holmes set a brisk pace, and I followed, my medical bag secure over one shoulder, the walking stick I had brought from London, providing welcome support on the increasingly steep incline. The path climbed steadily, winding between outcrops of grey stone and patches of heather that brushed against our legs as we passed. Behind us, Kinloch grew small and distant, its lights twinkling like fallen stars against the darkening land. Before us, the hills rose in massive silhouettes against the sky, their peaks lost in gathering darkness. We walked in silence, conserving our breath for the climb, attending to the placement of our feet on the uneven ground. The only sounds were our own footfalls, the whisper of wind through heather, and occasionally the distant bleating of sheep settled for the night. The landscape possessed a profound stillness, an ancient peace that seemed to reach back through centuries, to times when these hills had known no human presence at all. As we climbed higher, the view expanded behind us. The gleam of water in the valley below, perhaps the loch that MacLeod had mentioned, and beyond that, layer upon layer of hills receding into misty distance. The clouds had begun to break apart overhead, and through the gaps, more stars appeared, brilliant and cold in the crystalline air. After perhaps an hour of steady climbing, the path began to level somewhat, and we found ourselves approaching a col between two peaks. Beyond this natural gateway, the land opened into a broader valley. Glen Corrash itself, Holmes murmured, consulting the mental map he had constructed from our various sources of information. We paused at the col to catch our breath and survey the scene before us. The glen spread below, a shadowed bowl perhaps a mile across, its floor relatively level after the steep climb we had just completed. In the growing darkness, I could make out the silver thread of a stream winding through the glen, and near its eastern edge, just discernible against the hillside, the dark outline of stone walls, rising in a configuration that could only be the ruined chapel. And there, faint but unmistakable, came the sound that made us both freeze in wonder, the pure, ethereal notes of a violin, carrying across the glen on the still air like birdsong, like water over stones, like nothing quite of this earth. The melody was the same that Davison the porter had described, beautiful and strange and old beyond reckoning, and it seemed to speak of things lost and found, of journeys ending and beginning, of mysteries that transcend the merely mortal understanding. Holmes touched my arm gently, and we began our descent into the glen, moving quietly now, as if unwilling to disturb the music that continued to float toward us. The path led down through rough grass and scattered stones, past several standing stones that loomed dark against the sky, their purpose and meaning known only to those who had raised them countless generations ago. As we drew nearer to the ruins, the music grew clearer, and I could hear the passion and precision in the playing. The way Miss Ashford drew from her instrument not merely notes, but emotion, story, something that transcended technical skill to become pure expression. She was playing for herself, or perhaps for the place itself, or for whatever mysteries she had come here seeking. The chapel ruins resolved themselves into greater detail as we approached. Walls perhaps 15 feet high at their tallest point, with gaps where windows had once admitted light, a partial arch that might have been the entrance to the nave, and scattered throughout, pieces of carved stone that spoke of craftsmanship and devotion. Before the ruins, just as Reverend Mackinnon had described, stood a semicircle of standing stones, their surfaces rough with age and weather, arranged in a pattern that suggested both ceremony and purpose. In the space between the stones and the chapel entrance, illuminated by a small fire that burned in a sheltered spot, stood Elizabeth Ashford. She faced away from us, her violin tucked beneath her chin, her bow moving across the strings with fluid grace, her entire being focused on the music she was creating. The firelight caught the red of her hair, turning it to copper and gold, and cast her shadow long across the ancient stones. Holmes raised his hand, indicating we should wait, and we stood in silence at the edge of the stone circle while she played on, unaware of our presence. The melody rose and fell, building towards some conclusion, some final statement, and I found myself holding my breath, caught in the spell of it, understanding without words why this music had called to her across the years, why she had abandoned everything to come to this place and play it here, where perhaps it had first been composed in ages past. The final notes hung in the air like a benediction, then faded into silence, broken only by the whisper of wind and the gentle murmur of the nearby stream. Miss Ashford lowered her violin slowly, and for a long moment she simply stood, her head bowed, as if listening to echoes that only she could hear. Then Holmes spoke, his voice gentle and respectful. "Miss Ashford, forgive our intrusion. We have come to ensure you are well." She turned, startled but not frightened, and in the firelight I could see her face clearly. Young and fine-featured, yes, but also transformed by something that might have been joy or sorrow, or some profound mixture of both. Tears tracked down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "Mr. Holmes," she said, and her voice held no surprise, as if she had been expecting us, or perhaps as if our arrival was simply another part of a pattern that had been set in motion long ago. "And Dr. Watson, if I am not mistaken. You have come a long way on my account. I hope I have not caused too much distress." "Your friends were worried," Holmes said simply, "but we can see that you are safe and well. That is what matters most." She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I am sorry for the worry I have caused, but I had to come here, you see. I had to complete what my aunt began, to bring the music home to the place where it was born. She made me promise, before she died, that if I ever found the manuscript, I would play it here, in this glen, under the new moon. She said, the circle must be closed, the old ways honoured one final time, before they fade completely into memory. She gestured to the ruins, to the standing stones, to the glen around us. This was a place of music long before it was a chapel, a sanctuary where bards came to learn and practice their art. The manuscript I found contains one of the last pieces composed here, written down by a musician who knew the old world was ending, that the ways of the clans and the ancient songs would soon be lost. My aunt spent her life searching for traces of that lost tradition, and when she died, she passed that quest to me." Holmes approached slowly, moving into the circle of firelight. "And now you have fulfilled that promise. You have brought the music home." Miss Ashford smiled, an expression of profound peace settling over her features. "Yes, and I heard it, Mr. Holmes. When I played, I heard other instruments joining mine, voices that sang in languages I do not know, but somehow understood. Whether it was merely the wind and the echoes, or something more, I cannot say. But I know my aunt is at peace now, and I have honoured what she asked of me." "Then we shall not press you to explain further," Holmes said gently. "Such experiences are perhaps beyond the reach of mere words. But tell me, what will you do now? Will you return to London, to your career and your studies?" She gazed around the glen one last time, her expression tender. "I will return, yes. I have responsibilities and friendships that I value, and this was never meant to be an escape, but a pilgrimage, a completion. Tomorrow, when the sun rises, I will walk back to Kinloch with you, and from there, back to the world I left for these few days. But I am changed, Mr. Holmes. I have touched something ancient and true, and that will remain with me always, will inform everything I play from this day forward. We stayed with her there for perhaps an hour more, sitting by the fire she had built, sharing the bread and cheese that Mrs. Campbell had provided. Miss Ashford told us more of her aunt, of the stories and songs that had been passed down, of the years spent searching through old collections and archives for any trace of the bardic tradition that had once flourished in these remote glens. She spoke with eloquence and passion, and I found myself deeply moved by her dedication, by the way she had honoured both her musical gift and the legacy entrusted to her. When at last the fire burned low and the cold began to assert itself more insistently, we prepared to depart. Miss Ashford carefully packed her violin in its case, the manuscript tucked safely inside. She scattered the fire's embers and stood for a moment in silent communion with the place, her hands resting on one of the standing stones, as if drawing strength or offering thanks. Then, together, the three of us, we walked out of the glen and began the long descent toward Kinloch. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and behind us the ruins stood silent once more, keeping whatever secrets they had witnessed through the long centuries. By the time we reached the village, the hour was very late, and Mrs. Campbell had left the door unlatched for our return. We climbed the stairs to our rooms in exhausted silence, agreeing to meet at breakfast before beginning the journey back to London. Sleep claimed me gradually, and I dreamed of standing stones and ancient melodies, of firelight on weathered stone, of music that would outlive us all, carried on the wind through glens and valleys, echoing softly into eternity. And so our tale draws to its close, dear listener, as all tales must. The mystery of the vanishing violinist resolved itself not in darkness, but in light, not in tragedy, but in triumph of a quiet, profound sort. Elizabeth Ashford returned to London and to her career, carrying within her the gift of that pilgrimage, that moment of connection with something old and sacred. And those who heard her play afterward spoke of a new depth to her music, a quality that seemed to reach beyond mere technique to touch the soul directly. And now, dear friend, as this story ends and sleep beckons with gentle insistence, I hope you will carry with you something of that peace we found in the glen, that sense of mysteries honoured and circles completed. If you have enjoyed this journey into the foggy world of Victorian London and beyond, I would be grateful if you would subscribe to see more stories like this, and leave a like to let me know it brought you some measure of comfort. May your dreams be peaceful, your rest be deep, and may you wake refreshed and ready for whatever adventures await you in the days to come. Good night, and sleep well.